Let me start by wishing you all a happy Women's Day. I think many of you probably know that the commemoration of this day comes to us from the early 20th century when women workers in the UK and the US took out protest marches to argue for better wages. And since then, the day has acquired many meanings and morphed into many different things. But as with all the days that mark one or other thing, International Women's Day has now moved quite far from its history of laboring women and become an excuse, among other things, for marketing and selling all kinds of products, including motorbikes and jewelry and so on and so forth. So in India, among women's groups, the day is marked by celebrations and reflections in different parts of the country. And there's also a strong assertion by women activists that every day should be a Women's Day. There are also initiatives that mark different days and that emphatically assert their local context within India. One of these is the birth anniversary of Savitribai Phule, that is particularly significant for anti-caste activists. But for us here today, this occasion, the occasion of International Women's Day, gives me a chance to share some thoughts with you. And for that, I'm really grateful to BIC for having opened up this space. I want to start by showing you some slides, one of the International Women's Day, an International Women's Day poster from Germany, and followed by 5 posters from India. So if you see, this poster is from Germany, and this poster, I believe, was banned, and it is said that it's Lenin who gave the name International Women's Day to the 8th of March. And subsequently, you will see some posters produced by women's groups across India, which are part of a collection of posters that we have on our website called Poster Women. And the first of these, this one that you see here, is by a group in Bangalore called Vishtar. Can we see the next one? This one, as you see, is in Hindi and talks about women's strength. This one, you can see March 8, International Women's Day, from another part of the country. And all of these are on our website, and you can get information about them. This one, Breaking Barriers, Building Communities. So for the moment, we will stop at this. I want to talk to you today about the women's movement in India, but my talk will not be a structured argument leading to a conclusion, but in some ways it will address a range of questions that I am currently grappling with. And these questions are as follows. What do we mean when we speak of a women's movement? To qualify as a movement, should something be comprehensive and long-lasting, something that has a clear ideology, a leader, and possibly something that succeeds in making change? If these are the qualifiers, the women's movement as we know it today might fail on some, but not all of these counts. So I'm asking, is there another way we can think of the women's movement? Does a movement have to be linear and progressive for it to count as a movement? Or can we look at our histories as simultaneously taking place in different locations and talk about what that could mean? Must all of the so-called activities in a movement be collective? Or is there a way we can take account of the individual stories of different women who are involved in different kinds of activism? Can we look beyond what is being talked about to that which lies hidden and unheard to better understand how change takes place in society? Can looking at history, say the history of a movement, be something like mapping a mosaic where things happen, they interconnect, they grow, and they have setbacks? In today's talk, this is something that I would like to explore. So in any talk, it's customary to put some disclaimers, and here are mine. I'm not claiming to speak on behalf of or to represent something as large and complex as the women's movement in India, nor am I cognizant or not cognizant of the question of who can claim to speak on behalf of a movement, particularly a movement that is so leaderless and collective as the women's movement. Instead, what I'm presenting to you here is a personal perspective, albeit that of an outsider. As for me, the women's movement and feminism are my homes. They are what I live and breathe. They are where I belong. And in today's talk, I would like to tell you some of the stories of belonging and sharing. But first, in order to set the context, I want to look at a bit of history. As we all know, women played a major role in the independence movement in India, and although small in numbers, their presence was also crucial to the making of the Indian Constitution, where they contributed individually and collectively to all the key discussions. For example, on fundamental rights, on minority rights, on freedom of expression, on separate electorates, and so much more. And yet, their contributions are not acknowledged, and history gives us little information about them. I want here to show you a visual, or more correctly, some visuals that I use in my teaching. I teach a course on women and society in India at different universities. And years ago, when I began teaching this course, I asked my students who are postgraduates to tell me a little about themselves, including about the courses that they enjoyed. A particular favorite was a course called Makers of Modern India, which was based on the lives of 12 people who had been key to the making of the nation. Inveterate feminist that I am, I then asked my students the feminist question, one that is possibly in the minds of every feminist in this room, and that is, how many of those 12 were women? I don't think we need any guesses to know the answer. The answer was 0. My reaction to this was this unsurprising piece of information is one that every feminist in this room will recognize: a simultaneous fury, despair, resignation, and finally amusement. And thank God for the amusement, because it helps to keep the despair at bay. And then I did what feminists often do. I thought, I'm not going to be defeated by this. So this is what I did. I created a chart which I called Makers of Modern India 2, which had only women. And the chart has currently 20 women. And as the years go by, I keep adding to it. And more as I locate more and more women. I want you to look at this chart. I use it with all my students as a quiz. But here, because we are not students and we're all grown up, I just want you to have a look at it and at the one slide that follows. So Makers of Modern India 2, I don't know if you recognize any of these women, but each one of them had a major contribution to make in the making of the modern nation. So I'm not here arguing about the idea of nationhood and how acceptable or difficult it was, or arguing for the nation. But I am saying all of these women had a major role to play, and they are Begum Hazrat Mahal, Savitri Bai Phule, Annie Besant, a woman called Tarabai Shinde, Ramabai, Pandita Ramabai, Bhikaji Kama, Binodini Dasi, Muthulakshmi Reddy, Rani Gadinilu, and Hansa Mehta. Hansa Mehta was also one of the women involved in the making of the Indian Constitution, and several other things. What a major role that she played, which is very little known, is that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted in the UN, and Eleanor Roosevelt was heading the committee, the drafters created the first line of the document, which said, all men are born free and equal. And it was Hansa Mehta and a woman called Lakshmi Menon who argued for genderizing that language, for the document to read, all human beings are born free and equal. It's not a small contribution to make, and something that should be recognized, but it hardly ever is. These are another 10 women. Among these, I will tell you the names of only 2, and then I'll show you a chart which has all their names and dates, should you wish to look them up. The number 11 is a woman. Does anyone in this room recognize number 11? Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, thank you for that. And Rajkumari Amrit Kaur was India's first health minister from 1947 to 1956 or 57. But more than that, in February of 1956, I think it was, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur floated the idea of creating a medical institution in India which trained doctors and which ensured that there wasn't brain drain, but which also was a research and a practice place for patients. And it was out of that an institution called the All India Medical Institute was created, which the Rajkumari Amrit Kaur does not carry the responsibility for what happened to that institution after her death, but she is the one who had the vision to do it. And similarly, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, who is in this and who had a life in Bangalore as well, was responsible for many things, including creating for partition refugees the city of Faridabad as an industrial hub on the outskirts of Delhi. So institutions, culture, change, all of these things were things done by these women, which is hardly ever recognized in the making of the nation. These are their names. Should you wish to look them up, you can, and you will find through looking up their lives much more, and many more women who will expand the notion of the history of India. And these are the 15 women who were involved in the making of the Constitution. Nobody really talks much about them, but in recent years, we have two books that have been published. One of them by a writer called Achut Chetan. The book is called The Founding Mothers of Our Republic. And that really details the crucial role that these women played. But in the making of the Constitution, we seldom hear their names. So almost all the women in my chart of 20, barring one, Dakshayani Vilayuddin, who was Dalit, were upper class and upper caste. If we know so little about them, we know even less about the women on the margins of Indian society, who may not have been part of the mainstream movement, but who nonetheless fought for change in many different ways. In the years preceding and following independence, a number of other movements took place, which were more local, but which involved large numbers of people, many of them women. And I want to mention some of these as part of our history. So as early as 1927, in the lead up to independence, there was the Mahad Satyagraha, where Dr. Ambedkar led a march to the Chavdar tank to fight the practices that disallowed Dalits to drink water from the same wells and tanks where upper caste drank from. Women made up large numbers of the protesters in this. In the 40s, we have the Telangana Armed Rebellion, where women and men fought against exploitative practices of the Nizam in Telangana and feudal landlords, and set up communes wherein they discussed, among other questions, the issues of caste and gender. There was the Tebhaga movement, roughly at around the same time, also in the 40s, where Adivasi and Dalit people fought to reduce the landlord's share of the produce of the land they worked on. Thousands of women formed the leadership and the rank and file of this movement. They too should be counted among the makers of modern India. Later, in the post-independence years, we see other massive protests. The Shahada movement, again involving peasants who were Adivasi and Dalit, who came out in their thousands. Some of the protests were 20,000 strong, and where sexual violence became a major issue around which women rallied. The early 70s also saw the anti-price rise movement in Maharashtra, which was an all-woman movement that brought together factory workers, ordinary women, political workers, to fight against rising prices and hoarding. And as symbols of protest, they used their kitchen implements, the chakla, the belan, the tin of atta, the tin of oil, and so on. The emergency put a halt to this movement, and although it's not an exact or good parallel, I'm reminded of how COVID was used to shut down the Shaheen Bagh protests in Delhi. I want to mention one other movement at that time, which took place in Bodh Gaya in Bihar. It was led by Jayaprakash Narayan, and it was a movement made up of students under the banner of an organization called the Chhatra Yuva Sangharsh Vahini. And they came together to protest and acquire land from religious organizations and feudal landlords who, despite the promise of land reform, had managed to hold on to large tracts of land. The movement later became more diverse and brought in more people, and eventually it succeeded in taking back thousands of acres of land from a religious organization called the Bodh Gaya Mutt, and redistributing it to the poor. I think the recovery of land was something in the region of 5,000 acres. out of the 12,000 that was owned by the mutt. Now, I mentioned these movements first to make the point that while we do not know much overall about women's participation in the making of the nation, we know even less about the participation of women on the margins who were not necessarily fighting the national battle, but the issues they were fighting for resonated with much of what the nation was focusing on at the time: land reform, fair trade practices, the rights of those on the margins. I mention them also because while some of these were not specifically women's movements, there were large numbers of women involved in them, and their presence deeply influenced the course of the movement. It was the women in these movements who questioned patriarchy and patriarchal practices, not only by those they were fighting against, but also by their comrades and partners in the battles. So, for example, the women asked, why were they subjected to sexual violence by landlords and by their own men? Why were they always expected to stay in the kitchen? Why, when land pattas were distributed in Bodh Gaya, were the women left out of them? And so on. What was it like for the women who questioned their own comrades thus to even find the words to say what they felt, to find a language to describe the betrayal they felt? But equally, how amazing it must have been for them to find each other, to be able to speak together, and to be able to articulate what must have been a deep political understanding, something that academics theorize about. Because when the women were talking, they were talking about the double oppression and discrimination they faced. I think one of the most difficult lessons of feminism has been to understand the courage that is required to simply name the opposition. But it is not always, because the opposition is not always out there somewhere, but it is so often made up of those we care for, those we love, and those we live with. So, how to fight that battle that you believe in internally as well as outside? This is the legacy that women of my generation inherited when we came into feminism in the mid 70s. As young feminists then, who were just becoming involved in different issues, to have a history like this to look up to was both exciting and challenging. We may not have been aware of the rich history that had brought us to becoming a part of a movement, but we were not totally unaware of it either. The questioning by women within these movements led them to start talking to each other. That is, in each of these movements, whether it was Bodh Gaya, whether it was Telangana, whether it was the anti-price rise movement, whether it was elsewhere, women came together to talk to each other about the issues they faced. I want to flag here the importance of these conversations among the women who began questioning the movements from within. Sadly, we have no record of these, but to my mind, these were not mere conversations. They were a way of understanding inch by inch for the women how they were placed in the hierarchy of power and realizing through sharing how they could negotiate this. But how did they find the words to even articulate what it was they were feeling? How and where did they find the vocabulary? In the man made languages that they had at hand, where were the words to describe, for example, by women in the Bodh Gaya movement, the simultaneous sense of violation, betrayal, despair, disappointment, entangled with love and care at being left out of acquiring the land when they had fought to get it back. In the women's movement, we have always talked of the personal being the political. For many of these women, it was the political that drew them into the movements they became part of, and it was the personal that connected them with the larger realities of their lives. For the second part of my paper, I want to invite you to look at some individual stories with me. These are smaller, what we might call micro histories. Over the years, I have become increasingly interested in how ordinary women's lives connect and are linked to the women's movement in our country. I've asked myself if we can hope to draw a map of a movement through the stories of individual lives, if we can ask ourselves, what is that movement in a woman, what is that moment in a woman's life? And I know full well that this moment cannot be easily identified, but I think the question is still worth asking. What is that moment when an individual experience leads to something bigger? When a woman realizes, perhaps with shock, perhaps with recognition, and sometimes even with relief, that what she is feeling is shared by a vast sea of women around her. And when she decides to act on that reality, to remain anchored in the personal, for, what, for that is what her struggle is about, but to act on it not only for herself, but for a battle that she knows is more than just hers. What does it mean to leave the aloneness and feel part of a larger reality? I think we haven't asked these questions enough because we take women's activism at some level for granted, and at another level, we don't actually notice it. So we don't ask ourselves, what is it that it takes to recognize this feeling inside you and to see it as linked to a larger reality and to take that decision to move into the larger reality? I have no answers to these questions, but I feel increasingly, as age descends upon me, that these are important and necessary questions to ask, and that in asking and debating them, we may find our ways towards some answers. So let me turn to the stories that I want to tell you, and then we can come back and look at these questions. My first story is about a woman called Sharifa Khanum. In 1988, a large women's movement conference was held in Patna in Bihar, the third such conference to take place. This was a non funded, collectively organized meeting where women activists from groups across the country came at their own expense, and those who could afford to paid subsidized others who could not. Sharifa was one such woman. Originally from Tamil Nadu, she traveled from Delhi, where she was working, to Patna to act as a translator for Tamil women during the conference. She was familiar with Hindi, and much of the conference took place in Hindi, but she sat in, listened, and translated for the Tamil women who came from Tamil Nadu to the conference. As she listened to stories women told of abuse, of violence, of injustice, and heard women sharing them publicly, Sharifa, initially uninvolved, listened to them and she felt a strong sense of recognition. This was the story of every woman's life, every woman that she knew. It was the story of virtually every woman she had ever known and interacted with. But she was also surprised that such private things could be spoken of in public. That experience changed something for Sharifa. As she often said, it was a turning point in my life. I realized that it was possible for women to act together and negotiate a space for themselves in life. A couple of years later, she returned to Tamil Nadu and began to gather women together, at first just to talk and share their stories. They created a space for themselves at one of the local bus stops. Imagine this. I want to ask you to look at the cleverness of this step, which seems just a minor step, which to me is a piece of really clever strategy. Where are the public spaces for women to sit down and talk? They're not welcome at the chai shop. They're looked on with suspicion if they hang out in the park. They can't talk at home. And so these women choose a space that is public and where waiting is normal, the bus stop. And that's where they have their conversations. If this is not a clever and thought out strategy, I don't know what is. Sharifa then began to form a network of Muslim women. At this time, local governance bodies called the Jamaat, which delivered, at the time, local governance bodies called the Jamaat, which delivered justice in local matters at the village level. The courts were too cumbersome for people to go to, so they relied on these local bodies. They were all, not surprisingly, headed by men, and it was impossible for women to bring their issues to them. As Sharifa says, often the members of the Jamaat were older men in the community, and they were fathers in law, uncles, grandfathers of the women who were facing domestic violence and issues in the home. They could hardly bring their issues to the same people who held power in the home. How was this problem to be solved? So she then went back to the drawing board, so to speak, and decided to look at the Quran to see if there were any injunctions against women setting up similar bodies and found none. She decided to set up an organization called STEPS and a women's Jamaat, an initial group of 12 women, which today has grown into multiple thousands. It's a formidable force, and the women's Jamaat now handles many cases and indeed are often called upon by traditional Jamaats to look after their cases because they are more decisive and quicker to take decisions and more empathetic to everybody concerned. Meanwhile, the women have set themselves another task. They are now building, brick by brick, a masjid for women. A Bangalore-based filmmaker called Deepa Dhanraj has made a wonderful and evocative film on the life of Sharifa Khanum. I think it's called Invoking Justice, and I would encourage all of you to see the film, watch the film, and look at the work Sharifa is doing. How does Sharifa's individual trajectory fit into the larger activism of the women's movement? How does her individual rebellion, her questioning of the male monopoly signal wider questions of religion and the women's movement? These are questions I will leave with you as I turn now to my second story. The second story is about my mother and a woman called Satyarani Chadda. Sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, my mother was at lunch in our home in Delhi when she heard something unusual, screams and a commotion that seemed to be coming from the house across ours. It was late afternoon, generally a quiet time as the heat kept people inside their homes. She stepped out onto the balcony of our home and saw what looked like flames in the house opposite, except that they seemed to be coming from inside the house. As she watched, a young woman rushed out wrapped in a sheet and screaming for help. Other people followed. As neighbors watched, for by now many more people were out. And the young woman, whose name was Tarvinder, was put into a car and taken off to a hospital. She had severe burns, and 2 weeks later she died, but not before she left behind a dying declaration that specified that she had been set on fire by her mother-in-law and her husband. That moment turned my mother, then in her 50s, into an activist, and she went on to give evidence despite threats of violence and persuasion by neighbors and so on against the family that had burnt their daughter to death. She became part of a women's organization in Delhi called Sri Sangharsh, which campaigned in the streets of Delhi against dowry violence and rape. Later, she started her own organization called Karmika and took on the cause of women facing violence. One of Sri Sangharsh's campaign strategies was to perform street plays on dowry in the city and its environs. I remember how my mother's beautiful and powerful singing voice would rise to the sky when several people, I was included among them, were performing the play, and when as she sang the song that she sang, some of you may recognize. It's a song called Babul Mora Nayar Chutu Hijai. I'm leaving my home. And it is a beautiful, evocative song which she would sing, and everything would still around us as the song rose up in the sky. And all of us acting in the play would get goose flesh when we heard it. So she sang this song, and that summer, we organized a protest against dowry deaths in a place called Model Town in North Delhi. At the time, the newspapers, the media was not filled with yes men and yes women and yes people. And so the media reported extensively on the protest march, including naming the organization that had actually started the protest, that had led the protest, which was Sri Sangharsh, an organization all of us were part of. And this led a woman called Satyarani Chadda, whose own daughter, called Kanchan Bala, had been killed for dowry, to travel across the city to seek out Sri Sangharsh. And she came to our house and found my mother, and the two of them then began the battle for Satyarani's battle for justice. Satyarani fought for years the battle to get justice for her daughter. She eventually did secure a conviction, but by the time the conviction was secured, the man who was the killer had run away and disappeared, and no one could find him. So she did not have the satisfaction of getting justice. But Satyarani, bitter and disillusioned with the battle for justice, did not give up. And she went on to become a fierce activist in the women's movement who fought against dowry and violence against women. And along with another woman, a Muslim woman called Shah Jahan Appa, whose own daughter had been killed for dowry. So this thing crosses religions and crosses different classes. The two of them, Shah Jahan Appa and Satyarani Chadda, went on to form a women's shelter in Delhi called Shakti Shalini, which runs even today. Both women have now passed on, but the shelter continues to run. Let me now move on to my third story, which is not a story of individual women, but that of a group. And this is about a book that we published as publishers. It's one winter afternoon in the mid-'80s. Slide, please. I wanted to show people a picture of Satyarani. That's her. The photograph is shot by Shiba Chachi, and that is her showing her frustration at the legal process. Okay, let me now move on to my third story, which is that of a group of women. So one winter afternoon in the mid-'80s, shortly after we had started our publishing house Kali for Women, we were sitting out in the Delhi winter sun. And yes, we did have sunny winters in Delhi, although we don't anymore. When 8 women walked in. 4 of them were well-known activists from the health movement in India, and the other 4, judging from the way they were dressed, were women from Rajasthan. They brought us a book that they had created as part of their program, a book on women's bodies and women's health, and it was called Sharir Ki Jankari, and they asked us if we would be interested in publishing it. The book is in Hindi, and it maps the woman's body in terms from the moment of birth through adolescence to marriage to old age, and looks at things like menstruation, illness, pregnancy, and so on. The women told us the story of this book, which 75 of them had created in a series of workshops. Initially, they made just 2 copies of the book, and I've talked about this story often before, so I'm sorry if some of you have heard it before and you're hearing it for the nth time, but it is, to me, perhaps the most important book we have done till this day, and it's a book I love and cherish, and I do want to talk about it. So they told us the story. They said 75 of us got together in a series of workshops and we created this book. We talked a lot about how to represent the woman's body, how to represent the male body, and they created the book as a book that works with words and pictures, and the pictures are on one side and the words are on the other side because they created it for illiterate women, those who could not read, and if they could read, then they could combine the visuals and the words. Having made the book, they made 2 handmade copies of it and tested it in the villages around. All the villagers laughed at them and said, how can you call this a realistic book? Because the book, in an attempt to show the body, presented the naked bodies of the women and the men it was talking about. And the villagers said to them, you never see a naked woman or a man in the village, so how can you call this realistic? So, taking this challenge on board, the women went back to the drawing board and they thought about it, and they came up with an ingenious solution, which was to show the woman fully dressed, and that little white thing you see there is a flap that you can lift up, and then you see how she's made from inside. So completely modest. I have, the picture has been taken with the flap slightly lifted so that you see that there is a flap there. Otherwise, in a picture, it's difficult to see that. And when they did that, the entire book is filled with flaps. So you have the woman's chest and you open 2 doors and you see how she's made from inside, and then you can close them and it can be completely modest. And of course, they gave a similar treatment to Mr. Man, because neither does the woman walk around naked in a village, nor does the man. So the man's clothes in a Rajasthan village would be a dhoti and a safa with a bare chest. And yeah, men get to walk around with their chests bare. For what reason, I don't know. Yes. The man. And if you lift up the flaps on him, you can see how he's made. And the second picture shows actually a very, very interesting process of ejaculation, and you are seeing the little sperm coming out and everything, and they have ribbons around them. It's a work of complete genius as far as I'm concerned. So, not surprisingly, when the book came to us, we immediately agreed to publish it. As feminist publishers who had dreamt of going beyond the city, Delhi, and the language English, to which our class constrained us, we were looking at a work that actually crossed this, which involved poor women, Dalit women, daily wagers who had created a book, and they wanted us to take it into the world. They wanted to give us the responsibility of taking it into the world. So we were very excited, but the women were not willing to give it to us without certain conditions. And they imposed two key conditions on us. One of them was easy to accept, which was that we were allowed to sell the book in bookshops, although we have never sold a single copy in a bookshop, at any price we wish to. But to village women, we would sell it at cost. We were not allowed to make a profit from village women. So it was a condition that we agreed to instantly. The other one, surprisingly, was more difficult, which was that 75 of them had created the book, and they wanted all 75 names on the cover of the book. Now, for us, brought up in urban India, brought up in the academy, and thinking of authorship, we had only ever thought of authorship as singular, or maybe two authors, or maybe three authors. Because if you have more than that number, I mean, how do you put them on the cover of a book? How do you put them into the metadata that Amazon wants, although Amazon wasn't around at that time? But what do you do with 75 authors? You can't have a book that lists 75 authors and then you have a blurb about the book or such like. And so we were a bit foxed by this condition that they imposed on us. But then we also took our cue from them and became creative, and we decided that we would put all 75 names on the cover, but on the back cover. So the front of the book has only the title, and the back cover has all the 75 names in it, small, but they are there. So that was the story about that book. So I think one of the things that the women were also keen to convince us of, and this is a lesson we learned from them, was that the creation of knowledge is often not a singular enterprise. It is often collective, and it has to be recognized as such. And if they created it collectively, they wanted that to be reflected in the book. And that is also a lesson which relates to the women's movement, because where in the women's movement do you find a singular leader who can be seen as the face of the movement? It is a collective movement, and therefore pretty much everything about it is collective. I mean, can you imagine a similar process happening with a group of men? This is a question that I am putting to you without prejudice. I don't know if that might ever happen. So created by hand, by rural women, for rural women, this book was also evidence, if ever evidence was required, that the women's movement belonged not only to those of us who lived urban lives of privilege, but also to poor laboring women. It was one of these women, Bhavari Devi, a Sathin, in this very program from which this book came, who was subjected to gang rape by upper caste men, whose experience and Bhavari's experience led to the framing eventually of what came to be known as the Vishakha Guidelines, and later to what we know today as the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at the Workplace Act, the POSH Act. When we look at the POSH Act, and we're all doing trainings on the POSH Act, none of us remembered that it was a Kumhar woman from Rajasthan whose story began this questioning of what it means for women to feel safe in a workplace. So Bhavari, after her gang rape, and when women's groups came up to protest the gang rape, The question they raised, among other questions, was what is a workplace for a woman and whose responsibility is it to keep her safe there? Is a workplace only inside the four walls of the office, or can it be the field in which she operates, which is where Bhavri was, the bus in which she travels, the home in which she works, and so on and so forth? So the story of one woman led to this. How do these individual stories, I'm just checking how much time I have. Okay. Are you with me so far? Are you bored to death, or can I go on for another 10 minutes? Okay. Okay. So the questions I want to now ask, I am done with my stories, but I will sneakily sneak one in right towards the end. So how do these individual stories resonate with each other? I want to suggest that there are many things here that we can look at. First, to go back to my original question about how we understand movements and how we map them. Do these micro stories, and these are only 3, around us we have thousands of them, do they add up to something resembling a movement? I want to suggest that if we look at them not in a linear way, but as part of an almost simultaneous reality, the mosaic that I spoke of, we realize how much change is taking place in how many different locations and how widespread it is. Surely this says something. Surely this counts for something. How can we take account of it? I spoke earlier of the ways in which women in larger movements came together to speak with each other and listen to their stories, and how this helped them to advance their understanding, move ahead in their thinking. I want to suggest again here that for women who have been denied even a language, who do not find in existing languages even a vocabulary to capture their experiences of neglect, of being diminished, of rage, and of the so difficult entanglement of love and care with all of these, for them even to find the words to talk and articulate what they're feeling is an act of heroism, I think. When Sharifa and her friends talk of setting up a women's mosque, when they use the religious texts they have been handed down and which have always been monopolized by men, they are questioning entrenched authority in its strongest form. When such authority is combined with masculinity and with community, they are confronting that authority in the very site of its location. So it is not like an abstract straight state that they are challenging, to whom they're addressing their complaints, which the state may choose to hear or not hear. They are confronting authority where it operates, and that is dangerous, and that requires courage. And I do not think that we give them enough importance for that courage. It is the home and the community, and if this is not heroic, I don't know what is. I often wonder what were the first words Sharifa used to begin her conversations with the men in her community. What was the first attack that she faced? These conversations between women on the ground are not merely, as the writer V. Gita points out, they are not merely conversations. Rather, they are ways of advancing the women's understanding of the structural and systemic oppression they face. And then in this way, they're nothing short of a meshing of the empirical experience with the theoretical understanding, which we look at as separate things, because somewhere is the empirical people, the respondents who are doing the acts, which some academic in the academy is theorizing. But here you see a meshing and intermingling of the two, and I think this is really an important thing to mark. There are other aspects to this which are important for us to look at. In the women's movement, we have always spoken of how the personal is political, and for so many women, the struggle begins in the personal space. When women in the Bodh Gaya movement questioned their men about why those very men who fought alongside them were reluctant to live up to their progressive ideologies, what must it have taken them to do so? The resilience of patriarchies in families does not make it easy for women to speak out. A small number of women did succeed in finally getting land deeds in their names or in the shared names with their partners, But what must it have taken those women to continue to live in the same home with the same men who had earlier denied them their rights, and but who were still husbands and possibly comrades? So, how did they actually do this? Both Satyarani Chadda and Bhavari Devi found justice elusive in their personal battles, but that did not stop them from continuing to be involved in a larger battle. Being part of a larger reality in some ways could help to counter the sense of individual helplessness, and also perhaps they were and are able to draw some comfort from being part of a reality in which there were others who believed them and who cared. The writer and academic J. Devika puts this beautifully when she says that as activists in the movement, we cannot deliver justice. That is not within our power. But we can at least provide healing to those that are with us, who are with us. All the women around Satyarani, her comrades in the women's movement, provided what justice could not offer, healing and support. Denied justice in her personal case, Bhavari Devi knows today that her story has led to major legal changes. Whether or not that initiative, the legal changes, live up to their promises is not her responsibility. But for her role, tragically, for the suffering she went through, but for the change it brought about, she has the gratitude of thousands of women across the country. So the women's movement is often reviled for being elite, upper class, urban, and other similar things. And yet, as these stories show, that is not the only truth. Perhaps many of its visible activists, people like me, are upper class, but the real battles are being fought elsewhere, in villages where women are writing, in courtrooms where they are fighting, in homes where they are resisting. Indeed, some of the most important legislative changes that have come about in recent years have come about not because of elite women, but because of the contribution of poor women. Is there a way that we can see this as being part of a movement? Often movements are known for the issues they address or the places where they take place. So the Bodh Gaya movement, the Naxalite movement, the anti-price rise movement, and so on. But where women's movements are concerned, interestingly, there is no one location, not a single leader, there is no I. How then do we read these? I would now like to bring what I'm saying to a conclusion by telling you my final story, also of a book. I'm a publisher after all, so I have to talk about books. This particular book, co-authored by 9 women across 2 continents, helps us to better understand what I'm saying here. Originally written in Hindi, the book appeared in English under the title Playing with Fire and came about through a collective process in which women shared intimate personal stories within a supportive group. And they talked with difficulty and hesitation about some of the things that they had felt for the first time in their own homes and in their work as activists in a place called Sitapur in Uttar Pradesh. There were 7 rural women and 2 urban women, one of whom was an NGO worker and the other an academic from the US, and they came together to create this book. In collective discussions, they identified a method which would keep the stories of the women in their own voices, albeit in translation. And this method was that over a period of time, the women met and they told each other about their lives and they wrote diaries. And then these diaries were taken by the 2 urban women who then put them together under different heads, such as childhood, marriage, birth, and so on and so forth. They were then read back to the original writers, and it was only when the group as a whole was happy with the text that it was finalized. The book, when published, was credited to all 9 authors and to the group they formed. And here is their collective and moving description of this process, the process they went through. And I quote, they say, "When we were preparing ourselves to write this book, we felt a sense of adventure creeping into our bones. Would this world be able to see us, formerly uneducated women, as writers? Would it give us the same respect and wisdom that it accords to all its upper caste and elite scholars and thinkers? Would our readers be able to value the courage and trust with which we have pointed out our our most cherished and intimate moments, our deepest sorrows and wounds of humiliations, and everything sweet and bitter that we have encountered in our lives. The quote ends there. In this book, the women asked certain key questions. They asked, what is the difference between social empowerment and intellectual empowerment? Are they not two sides of the same coin? Their work was grassroots organizing. The work of the two city women was to put together the book that came out of their experiences. So they said, how do we then frame intellectual labor and activist grassroots organizing? Why should one be on a higher plane? Who becomes the subject of knowledge and who its purveyor? Does knowledge and expertise exist only in the academy, in places of power, or does it also exist in the minds, hearts, and daily lives of the powerless? You don't need me to tell you how important these questions are. In the process of sharing their ideas, the women began to understand themselves better. They also understood things outside of themselves. For example, they were all poor women. They understood that while poverty may be an overarching thing that united them, the ways in which it played out in the lives of the Dalit women among them was very different from the ways in which it played out in the lives of the Brahmin women among them. The knowledge that they together created was radically different, highly subversive, for it was based not on an extensive reading of multiple sources, nor on a gathering and analyzing of data, but on the lived experiences of women. One of the understandings that emerged for them as they compared their experiences was, as I've said, on the question of caste. A question they asked and discussed was, even if Brahmin women are deeply sensitive to the question of caste difference, can they ever feel the pain of humiliation and untouchability in the same way as the daughter of a Pasi or a Rayadas person can? What does it mean to feel for a group facing violence from a distance and enduring it yourself? In It is these discussions, interactions, actions that I want to draw attention to today, whether it is the Women Jamaat's work or that of individual women like Satya Rani or my mother or of the creators of Sharir Ki Jankari or the women who wrote Playing with Fire. What we are seeing here, if we choose to see, are discussions on patriarchy, on the body, on women's health, on caste, on knowledge production, on solidarity, and so much more. I can find no better way of articulating this than the women of Sitapur did. They asked, and this is the question on which I want to close my presentation. They asked, what would happen if our stories could replace the stories of Jhansi Ki Rani in our school textbooks? So I want to close by saying that it is these women that I want to honor today on the occasion of International Women's Day, and I want to ask you to join me in doing that. Thank you so much for listening.
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you so much. Uh, I just wanted to ask you this that, we say that it's often said that, raise your boys well, focus on their upbringing because, but more often than not in families, men are raised, they're constantly told that you will be the central decision maker of a family, or that a lot rides on your success, that you have to succeed for the structure or the family to go on. And not recognizing that it eventually leads to a very lonely kind of life where you have men who are successful, who are doing what is like expected of them, but then you know eventually that leads to a lot of problems. So I just want, and it all boils down to having those conversations with with your loved ones, within families, and they are difficult conversations, they're never easy. So I just wanted to ask you if you could give us some points of how to bring this to our daily lives in our actions, of how to change this, or how to sort of, change this conditioning without really, going hung ho about it. Or, yeah, if you could just.
Okay, thanks for that question. I see, you can hear me, the mic is on. No? Yeah. I see what you're saying, and thanks for asking it. I think there is no formula at all, but I think one of the first steps for men, and I think it's happening in some small way now, is to actually understand through the women's articulations in how women are pushed into roles that they do not necessarily want to play. These are all sort of set out for them, and they're supposed to fill into those roles. Now, if you are feeling, you as men, and I don't mean you individually, if you are feeling that as well, then you've already taken the first step to realize how this conditioning, or whatever you call it, impacts both, not only women, but men and women and everyone else in society as well. But what I find is that a lot of the time, because the discrimination towards women is so normalized and naturalized, men do not even notice it. Okay, I'll give you one example that I always talk about. So when I was a young girl growing up in Delhi, a young woman growing up in Delhi, and I started working, my job would often take me out into the city, and I would have to be out for several hours. The city had no public toilets for women. So now, for somebody like me who comes from reasonable amount of wealth or privilege or whatever it is, I could manage because I structured my whole day around stops at luxury hotels where I could walk in without being questioned and use the toilet. What happens to thousands of other women who are out working the whole day and who need these facilities? Now, not only did the state not notice them, but none of my male friends have ever noticed that women did not have toilets, because they did. They had them. And they didn't even use those damn things. They stood outside, so you could see public toilets and a man standing next to it being, I mean, really, it's crazy. So the first step for you is, if you see that both are facing different kinds of discrimination, but also to understand that you cannot only and must not only talk about your own discrimination, but also about that others are facing. And if you do that inside families, there are often solidarities, because everybody thinks it's happening to me and faces it alone. Say, if you have a sister who is being discriminated against in a different way, the two of you are able to talk. It gives you some strength to take that conversation to your parents. It's difficult to have those conversations, but I think you have to also remember that because you're talking, and I know this is a generalization, but often in families, there is caring, there is love. There may also be hostility, so let's not dismiss that. But the caring and love at least makes for a possibility of a conversation. And sometimes the smallest thing can do it. So I'll give you one more example. I'm sorry I give long answers to questions, but I'll give you one more example. So with my students at Ashoka University, I ask them to do a group project, and to do whatever they like. And in 1 year, several of my students decided to interview their mothers. So they went and spoke to their mothers, and they talked to their mothers, a conversation they had never had, women and men. Conversation about, what were your dreams before you got married? How did that change for you when you got married? Simple questions. One of the young men told me that when he talked to his mother, she told him something he had never known, which was that she had always dreamt of being a footballer. And the dream had gone. The day she got married, the dream went. And it was then, he's 24, he was 24 when he told me this, that he understood why she spent such a long time in the kitchen looking out of the window which looked onto a football field. So every day she would be seeing her dreams there. And he then went to her the next week and said, why don't we go and play football once a week? And they started to do that. And now the mother plays football with the son once a week. and they talk. Just something small can open up these conversations, but I think they're really important to have. I don't know if that helps, but maybe it's a way of thinking about it.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. So my question is, so in these recent years, you may have noticed that this as part of Women's Day, many of these like hotels or saloons, beauty parlors, jewelries, textiles, all these provide a lot of offers, discount, and freebies for women. So do you think these things are actually discrediting the importance of Women's Day?
I don't know about discrediting, um, because I think um, for those of us for whom Women's Day is important, it's not going to be, the importance of that day is not going to be altered by your next door beauty parlor offering free haircut or spa or whatever it is. So I don't know if they have the power to discredit. I think something that's important to note is that any and many of these things become opportunities for marketing, and many people use them. So, um, there are all kinds of idiotic goods being sold where Women's Day is used as an excuse to do them, jewelry and so on and so forth. But I sometimes ask myself this question also, that as publishers and as feminist publishers, we use Women's Day, use within quotes, we celebrate, we mark, we can say that we don't use it, because we see ourselves as feminists, perhaps we can call it a celebration and a marking, but we also encourage people to buy our books. Now, are we doing something wrong? I don't know. Are we profiting from it? I don't know. But it is, I think, when we question, and we have to question the corporate takeover of things that are important to us. That's how capitalism works. But we also have to turn the lens a little bit on ourselves. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you. Um, Hi, ma'am. Thank you for the amazing talk. And I don't know the etiquette around this, but happy Women's Day to all the lovely women in the audience. Uh, my question was about a point you made about these the micro narratives being called, whether or not they amount to a movement. I think the argument that you made was that they do, and it was pretty clear that some of them actually morphed into, like, they had enormous consequences. Um, However, and when I think about it, there also is, I think, an argument to be made about the sort of decentralized nature of it. Like the very fact that I think they were leaderless, is in a way very beautiful, because uh, they allowed for the different forms of discrimination that were happening to be dealt with in their own way. However, I was just wondering, when you look at the history of the women's movement in India, did you feel that uh, like a more articulated leadership or something would have helped, or like how do you see this the tension between it being leaderless versus decentralized in this way?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think not. I mean, I don't know of women's movements anywhere in the world um, that have had a singular leader by whose ideology and whose practice and whose thinking the movement has been led or grown. There have been, so for example, you can look at Lech Walesa or people like that who led the solidarity movement, etc. But nowhere in the world you find one single leader who, even in America, where you had a really strong campaign in the 70s for all the states to accept the Equal Rights Amendment in the states. You had some 50 women. And there was Gloria Steinem, and there was Bella Abzug, and there was so many other women leading different aspects of the movement. So although it was a concentrated movement with a singular aim to get 50 states to sign the Equal Rights Amendment. Yeah. So I don't think that single leader movements anywhere in the world have been so deeply transformative for us to aspire to that. Instead, I think the transformations that are being created on the ground by small groups and leaderships, those are important to mark. Now, do they add up to a movement or not is a question I don't have an answer to. It's a question I'm grappling with. But what I feel is that when we look at them and we try to map the changes that they have made, those changes are not insignificant. So the question then becomes, how do you measure and map a movement? By its linearity, by the time it lasts, by its leadership, or by its impact on the ground, or by the change it makes? And we don't really have answers to those questions, but I think those are questions that we need to ask. So I don't have an answer to you, but this is maybe just a way to think about it, which can help us to get deeper into these issues.
Hi, I'm Preeti, and first of all, I would like to, thank and the women's movements, which has brought us, the women of our generation, to a point that we are so educated, and we're able to stand our ground. And as someone who comes from a legal background, I have seen that these laws against domestic violence and rape, they have strengthened so many women that I've seen around me that. The example you told, that a woman was being burnt, we are not seeing such cases so strongly and in urban areas these days, but even small incidences of violence are being reported. But on the other hand, we see that in the media today, that the laws, especially in the light of recent cases, that the laws are being said to be misused. And I feel that a lot of women are now feeling hesitant to even report cases that they may be, labeled as, they may be labeled in a negative light, right? So in this current situation today, how do we reconcile this reality that, on the one hand, we have progressed so much that women are strong and are able to, find their ground. And on the other hand, they are being fearful of the environment being created. And it impacts men as well. There would definitely be cases which would which may be fake, or which may be false. But how do we reconcile this, that there are women who are actually suffering?
So I don't think that. Let me go back to what I was saying earlier. I think the women's movement, so again, do we call it a movement or not? But if we do, if we look at, you mentioned education. So if we look just at the history of education, okay, in India, women's education, it is only towards, 20 years short of the 20th century. So in the 1880s or something like that, in India, the number of, in India, 98% of girls of school-going age in India were out of school. Okay. By the end of the century, in the next 20 years, there is progress, so that number reduces substantially. I don't now remember how much it was, but there were, I think, about 45,000 women by that time who come into school education. In university education at that time, I think the figure goes up from 6 women to about 245 or something like that. So you see change in those 20 years, and then the change is much more rapid after that, because women's educational institutes are opening up, and they're opening up largely as a result of the efforts of women like Rokaya Sakhawat Hossain, Savitri Bai Phule, Hansa Mehta, and a whole lot of others who are actually fighting and opening schools. Hansa Mehta, of course, comes much later, but this is what is happening. This is what opens the way for women in education. Today, the enrollment figures are very high. Women are there in a majority in, say, institutes of law and many other places. But has that totally changed the realities of their lives? Has that transformed the realities of their lives? We can't actually say that. Partly it has to do, of course, with what one might call education and the quality of education. Partly it has to do with what is happening in the home, and it has to do with a whole range of other things. But I think the progress or change can never be linear, and it is always a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or the other way around, because the forces that oppose change are also gathering strength. And as you yourself said, that the violence, for example, men, in terms of the rights, privileges, etc., men in India have much more than women do. But men also still face violence. You look at a place like America, I don't know if you read in the news yesterday that there is a small these federal cuts where Trump is saying that shut down offices, etc., and Mr. Musk is going around spreading terror everywhere. So they went off to a small organization that has a fund of $40 million and that works in Africa. And they tried to shut it down. They tried to invade the office and throw people out. And the group of people in that small office resisted and held out. But just for a day, because they know they cannot fight the system. Now, who would have expected that in a place that lays such claim by freedom and so on and so forth, you would get goons to come and throw out people who are legitimately working in an office simply because the goons have decided that that kind of work is no longer legit. So you could ask that question, where have rights progressed when you see this kind of violence? And those two things will happen simultaneously, but that doesn't mean that we give up the struggle for rights, because the spread of violence for women, of course, has to do with also what goes on in the family, but we have to fight to somehow get rid of it. So I don't know if this helps, but it's a conundrum that I don't think we can ask the why question, but we can ask the how question possibly.
Hi, ma'am. Thank you. Hi, ma'am. Thank you for the talk. So I'm a young professional in HR, and this is an offshoot of one of the questions which was asked earlier regarding these discounts discrediting the Women's Day movement. I'm curious, is there any way, Women's Day can be holistically celebrated in corporate without it being just a token gesture?
It's difficult to know, but I think I'm just looking at how BIC is celebrating it. And I looked at the program and it seemed to me like a really fascinating program. I suppose corporates could learn a bit, but most corporates, I don't know, they don't seem to be particularly interested. I'll tell you a story. I was invited some years ago by a large corporate who is a big steel company. I will not name it, but I think you probably know who I'm talking about. There were 200 people, and I was talking to them about Women's Day and about women. And they listened with, I don't know, attentively, but not with that much attention, because for many of them, especially for the guys, it was just like something they had to do. But I thought it was worth doing because I thought inside corporates, one should be talking about that. At the end of the talk, they came up to me and they said, thank you. And they gave me a huge box and said, we'd like to give you a small gift. It was really like a monster box that big. I couldn't carry it. It needed 2 men to carry it into the car, which they had sent for me. And then when I got back and opened it, you know what it had in it? It had steel bartans. I mean, what they were very useful because it's damn good quality steel. So that was okay. But you call someone to speak on Women's Day and then you give them steel utensils. What are you saying? So obviously your understanding is really basic. And so I don't hold out much hope for corporates. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, for the session. My question is around the makers of modern India list, which you came up with, right? So, what were the kind of research which you did behind it? Like, was it only the social and political lens which you looked at, or was it like technical and art side also?
What were the kind of? Sorry, I couldn't hear you very well.
So, what were the kind of research which you did for it? Like, was it the social and
Oh.
political lens which you looked at, or was it like technical or the art side also?
Okay. Glad you asked that question. I did not do much serious research when I made the chart, but I did a lot of serious research subsequently because I got interested myself. You know, because I'm a publisher, so many of these women's stories were in my head because we have published about them. For example, we published Uma Chakravarti's book on Ramabai and so on and so forth. So I knew about some of them. So I just kind of delved into my head. Then I just did some very basic internet research, you know, keying in things like women in the making of modern India, this, that, and the other. And when you start doing that, it leads you deeper and deeper. But of course, none of those sources is 100% reliable because they are on Wikipedia. So you then have to go to other sources. So for example, I read many pieces on the net about the 15 women in the making of the Constitution. But it wasn't until I read Achyut Chetan's book recently, the book that I mentioned called The Founding Mothers of the Constitution, that I found a huge amount of material that led me to their speeches and so on and so forth. So that initial chart was sketchy. Over time, it has grown. And now, for example, one of the things I feel is this is fine, but I need to look further. So I'm trying to create local charts, you know, looking at, let's say, Karnataka, looking at Assam and the Northeast, places like that. I'm trying to create charts which look at Dalit women. I'm trying to create charts which look at Adivasi women, which look at women who were involved in business. So, for example, Anasuya Sarabhai, others, you know, that kind of thing. So then you start with the net and then you go on to other things. Does that help?
This might be a very basic question. As I was, in the morning when I was talking to my wife and there was these WhatsApp messages for Women's Day coming in, she said, like, I'm dreading this, like Women's Day messages. So I just wanted to understand from your vantage point why is Women's Day important?
You know, it's not a basic question at all. It's a very important question. And frankly, I don't know. That's the short answer. In a sense, it's important historically. Okay, it's important historically because it marks a moment in the international women's movement when labor protests happened on the part of women and these spread across Europe as well. So it's important in those terms. Now, is it important for us? Well, in the past, carrying the awareness that it is something that comes from the West, in the past, it has still been a moment when women's organizations campaigning on different issues have come together across India on a common agenda. They've talked to each other and they've said, okay, let's use this day to lobby to talk about XYZ, housing rights, land rights, etc., etc. And that makes for a very important solidarity. And it has been a day on which, therefore, women have also celebrated. They've said, okay, let's get together and let's just have fun. Let's have a party and let's all bring our food together and have fun. But over the years, that also has morphed and changed because I think the ways in which people are working now are very different. And therefore, you have many local celebrations which happen on this day. But there are also celebrations that happen on other days, like Savitribai Phule's birthday and so on and so forth. So there are certain days which are marked, which offer moments to reflect, moments to think, moments to get together, to celebrate, moments to possibly lobby together. I suppose that is what gives them their importance, but it's always a question whether we need to celebrate 8th March as Women's Day or whether it can be any other day. And as I said at the beginning, there are so many people who say every day should be a Women's Day. So no need to mark out a special one. So the jury's still out on that.
Hi, ma'am. Thanks for the answer. And also, like, maybe just a personal note to that question. Um, for me personally, like, today was the first day that, because I'm recently married, I decided to think about it a little bit. And also, my wife is from a nation where, you know, the rights of women are very, very suppressed. So I was just thinking, and we spoke to my wife's family and realized how difficult it is for them. Whereas living in India, it's much more, or at least in Bangalore and in these cities, it's much more free for women to do the things that they want to. And I realized how important it is, because it was Women's Day, and because of my personal circumstances, I came to your talk, and we came to your talk, and maybe I'm a little more inspired. So from that perspective, Women's Day has been good for me so far.
Thank you. That's lovely.
Yeah.
That's so nice.
But the question that I had for you was related to the conversation that you were having about how in Africa there was this place that was doing something that was meaningful, and it was being shut down. And the idea that there is this overshadowing, like, set of forces that are causing humanity to possibly regress and to reach a state which is maybe very difficult in, like quite bad in human history, right? But there are also these examples of resistance and also constructive forces. For example, the story of Sharifa Begum or Sharifa Khanum that you spoke about early on. So my question was, for those people who are at the forefront and who are working with a group of people um, in a way that is constructive, specific in this case for women, or for any movement that is meaningful and constructive, what are the characteristics of those people that you found, maybe a few characteristics that help them really make a dent in society?
That's a really tough one. Yeah. I think one thing, to go back to what you earlier said, where there you mark this trend across the world, where there is increasing violence, increasing rigidification of differences, etc. I think, although you didn't ask this, but to me, that's the question that lay behind what you said was, how do we keep up hope in that kind of context? And I think it's the smaller stories really that give us hope, because if it is possible in such difficult circumstances for women to fight whatever obstacles come their way, then I think that that's really something we have to note as I said, as an act of courage. What are the characteristics? I don't know, because it's very difficult to say what it is that helps someone to move into the next stage. But one thing that I can say is that in at least in all the instances I know, and the work that I have done in interviewing women, etc., they are never alone. What never They may be alone in the home, or in whichever situation they take the first step, but the support and solidarity of women's groups around is what gives them a home and a place to feel safe in an overall environment which may actually be reasonably dangerous for them. So I can say it requires courage and so on and so forth, but I think it would be wrong of us to assume that. You know, it's a bit like you're aware, of course, of the December 12 gang rape that took place in Delhi, and how the woman whose name is Jyoti Singh Pandey was named Nirbhaya because the state wants to put out this image that she was fearless. But how can anyone be fearless in a situation like that? So, it becomes a characteristic or something to define a person, but it's not of their choosing. So I would hesitate to answer that question.
My question is about your own history with the women's movement. When I was in college in the 80s and 90s, reading Manushi and the publications of Kali for women, including your books, was really inspiring. And could you say, maybe this is the subject of a whole other lecture, and I'm sorry to be asking this at the end, but could you say a bit about your own establishing of the press and your involvement in Delhi?
Sorry, say that again. I think I need a hearing aid because.
Could you say a bit about how you came to establish Kali for Women, the women's movement in Delhi at the time, because your stories both in Manushi and later Kali for Women publications were very inspiring when we were in college.
Okay, I'll try to do that reasonably fast. It's a long story. So I was a young feminist growing up in Delhi and very involved in the women's movement. But like everybody else, we all need jobs. So I found my first job in a publishing house. Although this is extraneous to the question you're asking, but I instantly fell in love with publishing and decided this is where I want to stay all my life, which is what I've done. The job I had was a very inglorious one. At that time, the Oxford University Press, with whom I was working, and this is again extraneous to your story, but it's a fun thing, so I'll mention it, that they were adapting English textbooks produced or written by British authors to Indian schools because it was 20 years into independence and we didn't have any textbooks of our own. We were still making them. And all the adaptation involved was changing the British names to Indian ones. So my job was to change John and Mary to Ram and Sita. That was the imagination of the publisher at that time. And so what I had to do was I was called a paster upper. And I used to have these sheets of paper which said Ram, 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 Sita, 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 Sita. And then I had a pot of glue and a blade, shaving blade, which I used to take from my father or my brother. And then I had to cut Ram and paste it over John, which is a real exercise because John has 4 letters, Ram has only 3. So you have to get little white space on the side, equal space. And Sita fit nicely over Mary. So my task was that, and they had employed an artist whose task was to cut off the tops of double-decker buses, because only Bombay had double-decker buses in India. So if you wanted to make it Indian, then you had to have single-decker. So he used to paste white paper over the top deck and then if those of you who are familiar with original typewriters will know that to make corrections on typewriters, we had to use something called whitening fluid. So he used to put the whitening fluid on the rest of it and then draw the bus. So that was my introduction to publishing. It's a totally extraneous story, but I just mentioned it to you because I find it fun. And I was also very involved in the women's movement. We had set up, I think 73. No, we were planning on setting up a women's magazine. We had taken up different issues in college. The university where I had been was full of excitement at the buzz of participating in political activity, looking for better hostel conditions for women, getting buses for women, etc., etc. And we began to get involved in the anti-dowry and anti-rape demonstrations. And that is when I realized, and many women, not only me, many of us realized that actually we had no literature. We had no knowledge of the issues we were jumping into. We knew they were wrong. And so we rushed out into the fields with our placards and shouted slogans and did street plays, etc. But what was the history of dowry? Who did it impact? Was it only Hindu? Was it only middle class? Was it only North India? We knew zero. and there were no books. At that time, I remember there were 2 books, one pamphlet, both pamphlets about dowry. And so we couldn't understand anything. So then I went to my bosses, who were really nice guys, mostly Bengali, 2 Englishmen. And I said to them, why don't we publish books about women? And, there's so many questions, etc. And they said, women, but do they read? Do they write? Their issues are not serious. Who's going to publish? So it was a bit like my reaction to the question of how many women are there. I thought, okay, what does one do about this? These are nice guys. If they don't see this necessity, nobody else is going to. So that's when I thought, okay, I will do it myself. And I discussed it with friends in the movement, an activist friend, and all of whom said we have a need for this kind of publishing house. So that was what led to the setting up of Kali, and we began to publish books by women, about women, as a not-for-profit. Does that give you a bit of background? I can't keep talking more and more. I'll do another 1-hour talk.
Hopefully not the least. You know me and I've known you for years. Teaching at LSR, of course, you inspired a whole lot of people. So when you go on saying you're just a publisher or into that, I'm not taking that. You're more an activist, I think, than a publisher. That's my viewpoint, or maybe both going in together. My question to you really is, so much went into making of the Vishakha law. And we know that even Justice Verma passed away. I was on 2-3 boards for the Vishakha law. How effective is it today, now? Because I don't hear about it. That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, so Vishakha, as you know, has been replaced by POSH, right? But I think, actually, and I'm glad you asked that question, that when we had a set of guidelines, the sincerity with which they were implemented was somehow greater than when we have an actual law. Because while the law stipulates that you must have a committee, you must have X number of meetings, etc., it's often very easy for organizations who are not interested in the processes to just tick the boxes and be done with that and file a report which seems to show that they've done all the right things. Very few organizations actually invest in sensitizing their colleagues and talking about sexual harassment and what it means in the context of a workplace and so on. But that is not to say that we should give it up, because the gap between a law and its effectiveness is always a huge gap. There are organizations that actually take POSH beyond what it says. And that, for example, POSH only applies to men harassing women. But there are organizations that say, okay, we have other kinds of harassment. There are trans people, there are others. We will get this too. We'll rewrite our own sexual harassment policy document to cover all this. There are organizations, a lot of them among NGOs, who actually do sensitivity trainings, which are very deep and which are like conversations where everybody can ask the questions that are in their mind. Because so much about that training, which should not be a training in law, has to do with the doubts that people have, which they're afraid to articulate because they think they'll be shouted down. And which sometimes, they're afraid to articulate because those doubts also reek of certain kinds of prejudice and so on and so forth. But we have to talk about all of those. So I think the law gives us the possibility of opening up these spaces, and that should not be abandoned. The law itself should be the last recourse if we need to. But because once you get into the legal process, then it's, there's no room for nuance. And these are so many issues on which the discussions have to be nuanced. So, but I don't think that should mean throwing out the law. So that would be my answer. And thank you for saying that I'm more of an activist. I actually, in the early days, used to worry about whether publishing was activism. But now I've resolved that debate, and I think it is. So I'm quite happy to be a publisher / activist.
And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for being here and wish you a great weekend ahead. And of course, thank Professor Butalia once more. Thank you.